We're expecting important decisions today, said the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky before he arrived at the G7 summit in southern Italy. And that is because perhaps the headline announcement we're expecting from this meeting of the leaders of the wealthiest industrialized nations is over a new plan to make seized Russian assets sweat for Ukraine's benefit. This group of seven might once have been seen as the cosy and exclusive club of the world's traditional power brokers, an intimate gathering who around a small table could bend events to their own will. But if that were ever the case, it feels pretty distant today. The war in Ukraine appears to be tilting towards Russia, at least in terms of recent battlefield gains, and many of the G7 leaders, with perhaps the notable exception of the host, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, are under tremendous pressure domestically. So what can they achieve at their splendid retreat in southern Italy? Francesco Galletti is the CEO and co-founder of the Rome-based political risk consultancy Policy Sonar. What does he make of this plan to squeeze the interest from frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine?
It's very significant. There was an earlier undiluted version of it, which entailed the outright confiscation of the assets. So the one you're mentioning is already a new version of it. It's slightly watered down, but it's still substantial. The big question here is whether this G7 in its current composition is willing to move ahead, to press ahead with this plan. And this will be a litmus test for Giorgia Meloni herself. She is the pro tempore chairwoman of the G7. She is the host. But she's also a staunch Atlanticist. At least that's how she has positioned herself all along. And so now whatever happens will be on her as well.
There had been a European Union plan to do something similar, from what I understood, that had been agreed fairly recently. Is this just more of the same, or is it significantly different?
It seems to be a balancing exercise between the very early Janet Yellen version, so the US version of it, which was, again, outright confiscation of the assets, and the European Commission version, which is let's just use the interest that accrues on the assets. So we'll see where the needle stops, where the pendulum swings, in which direction.
Is it fair enough to say, though, that the G7, its ambitions in terms of how much it can help Ukraine financially and also how much it can hurt Russia economically, those ambitions have changed a bit since the start of the full-scale invasion? I mean, when it was confidently predicted by the leaders of the G7 that the Russian economy was pretty much going to implode, that I think Joe Biden said something about the ruble becoming rubble. That was his gag. It doesn't seem to have worked out that way.
We're in for a war of attrition. It's a protracted conflict. Clearly, everyone has the dream of quick war, quick and intense, but what we're witnessing is something completely different, and it's a prolonged effort. And so there is a little bit of that as well, like adapting expectations to this paradigm.
We've talked about Ukraine. I guess it's one of the things with G7 summits always is that these are world leaders who are confronting a very troubled world. Do you think they will also spend time discussing the Middle East, which is perhaps the other headline conflict of our time?
It's inevitable. I mean, clearly, Ukraine is looming large on the agenda, but there's Middle East as well and trade imbalances with China. And the Middle East, once again, is a big issue for the host country, for Italy, because Italy historically cultivated deep ties with the broader Mediterranean, Maghreb, and the Gulf. But also, and in particular, Giorgia Meloni has strong ties to Bibi Netanyahu. So considering what's happening in Gaza and Israel and how much this is sending shockwaves across the broader Mediterranean, it's going to be a very painful topic for Meloni, not only because it's a political balancing exercise for her, but because what happens in Gaza undermines one of Meloni's brain children, that is the Mattei plan, her grand strategy for Africa and the broader Mediterranean, which hinges on stability of the broader Mediterranean. And clearly what's happening in Gaza is sending shockwaves and destabilizing this area.
Tell me a bit more about Giorgia Meloni, because she is a fascinating figure. And obviously, the host of any G7, and it changes year on year, they have a certain amount of power. But Giorgia Meloni, she does seem to be in a particular position at the moment. I mean, her party did pretty well in the European elections. But when she looks around the table, she looks at the position of the Japanese Prime Minister, the French President, the German Chancellor, the British Prime Minister, the American President. I mean, they are all in a lot of domestic political trouble at the moment. Does she have extra power? Because in a sense, she is seen as being sort of, at least domestically, quite a successful politician.
Indeed, she is surrounded by lame ducks, which is a more brutal way to put it, and she still has lots of tailwind, and because of all that, she is punching above her weight. So she has a great opportunity here to make a mark. Let's see how she plays her cards. She needs to come up with something. It has to be geopolitical. We see indications that she also wanted to have more cultural issues on the agenda, like she is refusing to include in the communique, in the final statement of the G7, any reference to abortion rights. So let's see. It's true that she came out victorious of the latest EU elections. She still has momentum in Italy. She cannot waste her opportunity, and her Atlanticism will be put to the test. Has she become overconfident? It happens pretty frequently to leaders who do well at elections. They lose the understanding of the facts on the ground. Like, we have to watch closely what Meloni is up to.
And that was Francesco Gaglietti from the Rome-based political risk consultancy Policy Sonar. You're listening to Newshour, live from the BBC.